Last week, Will gave us a good overview of Exodus because we're going to be flying. It seems like we're flying through it because you can't cover everything, as you'll see about what happens for next week. But good overview of the Exodus, but I thought I'm going to take even one step further, just for 5 minutes, I think 5-7 minutes, and talk about where Exodus is really in what's called the Law of Moses. You don't see the word, you see the word Exodus described as an event, but not as a book. You don't see Genesis mentioned as a book in the Bible. They aren't mentioned that way, but they are referred to in both the Old and the New Testament as the Law of Moses, or Moses. So if you ever heard those terms, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about these first 5 books. Another word that's used in Hebrew is Torah. So if you've ever heard the Torah, it could be referring to those first 5 books. And another word that you don't find in the Bible, but it's a Greek word that you'll hear people talk about sometimes, is Pentateuch. And the Pentateuch is also referring to that. Penta, the first part of pentagon, Greek word. So it's a 5-sided building. The Pentateuch is a 5-fold book. And I like the idea that it's book singular, because really this is all meant to be one book, 5 parts. And so one just goes right into the other. And I'll kind of show you that, because I'm going to give you just about 2 minutes on each one of these books. Because I'm thinking, as I was thinking about this maybe a month ago, before I planned this, I thought, now, what's in Exodus, what's in Leviticus, what's in Numbers? I'm kind of confused about what was in each one, and how do they fit together? And they do fit together, and so this will kind of give you an idea of that. I'm going to put a timeline in the bottom here too. Creation, there's a little vase blocking anything here. Creation, ballpark 4000 BC. I'm doing real big ballpark stuff. And then we have the fall, when Adam and Eve disobey God. We have the flood, approximately 1600 years later, around 2400 BC. Then the focus changes from the world to one man, Abraham. And he's born ballpark 2165 BC. So he's born, and then we go from him to his son Isaac, and then to his son Jacob. And then Jacob has 12 sons, and one of those sons is sold into slavery, who is Joseph, you're right. Sold into slavery, eventually becomes the prime minister of Egypt, and the whole family comes down, Jacob and the rest of the family, 70 people in all, come down to Egypt. They are all there as guests of the Egyptians, and then Genesis ends with Joseph dying, ballpark of 1800 BC. Ballpark of 1800 BC. So that's Genesis. Then we go into Exodus. In Exodus, things change from the Israelites being guests to now they become slaves. Somewhere in that time frame, how long after Joseph, we don't know, but somewhere along the line, they become slaves. And then we see, and this is really abbreviated because Will's already covered it, the birth of Moses, ballpark 1525 BC. And so for the first 40 years, Moses is in Egypt as a prince. At the end of 40 years, he flees Egypt. And then after 40 years, he has an encounter with God at the burning bush. He goes back to Egypt. And spoiler alert for next week, they're going to have an exodus from Egypt. You probably already knew that, but spoiler alert. And so that's ballpark of 1445 BC. Exodus doesn't end there, though. It goes 1 year further to when they get to Mount Sinai. And so that's a ballpark 1 year later. And so the second portion of Exodus is God giving the law to Moses, or some of the law to Moses. That's where you'll find the 10 Commandments. It happens to be in that section, amongst many other laws. And I think that's where you find the construction of the information about the building of the tabernacle as well. Now, things change a little bit with the next book, Leviticus. You see this date, 1444? Leviticus doesn't cover any further time. Because Leviticus, I learned, as I was preparing this, I learned Leviticus is also all takes place at Mount Sinai. But now it's other instructions that God is giving Moses. And so here's a list of other instructions he's giving him. He's talking about the sacrifices and the offerings. He's talking about the duties of the priests. Talking about laws for daily life, like what happens if your ox gores your neighbor or something like that. Then he talks about festivals, and particularly the 3 big festivals all Jews were supposed to go to Jerusalem for eventually in the future. And then he gives some promises and warnings. So no further time, it's just all taking place that first year into the wilderness. Well, Numbers is going to pick up in time frame because now they're going to be traveling from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. Now you may be wondering, what is Kadesh Barnea? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because this is where now they've traveled, and Kadesh Barnea is just, I should have put a map here, but it's just south of the Promised Land. So they gather there. Moses takes 12 guys, 1 from each tribe, sends them out into the Promised Land, scope things out. The 12 come back, and they say, oh, this land is fantastic. It is wonderful. It is fruitful, bountiful. But then 10 of them speak up and say, but the cities are walled, and the peoples are giants. We felt like grasshoppers in front of them, and they're just going to devour our children. And then 2 of them, who we know their names, you got it, Caleb and Joshua. That's right, Caleb and Joshua. They say, well, they are true. We didn't feel like grasshoppers, but if God said the land is for us, we can trust him. We can trust him.
As for me and my house.
Yeah. Is that, who said that?
Joshua.
Was that Joshua that said that? Okay, so you can see his attitude even then. You know, we're going to trust God. Unfortunately, the 10 won out. And so the people believe the 10, and they're like, oh, why did we ever leave Egypt? And our children are going to be consumed by these giants. Well, then God speaks up and says, if that's the way you feel, no, you're not going to enter the land. And so for the next 40 years, you're going to wander for 40 years. Over the next 40 years, everyone who is 20 years old and older is going to die off. And so you will never enter the promised land, but the children that you said were going to be consumed by the giants, they're going to enter the promised land. They're going to reap all the joy. And so for the next 40 years, they're wandering around the wilderness. Eventually everybody dies off except for Caleb and Joshua, and at this point Moses still. So everybody else is maximum of 40 years old, which is pretty amazing. And so they eventually get back to Kadesh Barnea again, but from there they don't enter the promised land that way. They circle around to Moab. Now Moab is just east of the Jordan. So if you remember, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho.
Yep.
That's what's going to happen when they cross the river from Moab. It's going to be at Jericho. So if you have your mind's eye a picture, that's where they're at, and that's at ballpark of 1405 BC. So we're 40 years in the wilderness now. Deuteronomy, a lot like Leviticus, it's not going to cover any additional time. But what's happened here is, as I mentioned, all the people that were 20 years older and older are gone. And so you have a whole new generation. And so Deuteronomy is really Moses retelling. Some people say, why is he retelling? Well, it's because he has a whole new generation of people. So he's got to teach them as well. And so you find in here, he reviews the last 40 years' journey. He reviews the law for the new generation. And that's where you'll find the second reading of the 10 Commandments. And that's why it's in there twice, because you're talking to a different group of people. You have Moses reviewing Israel's covenant relationship with God. And there's a lot more on all of that, but I already took more than 5 minutes for all that.
That was amazing insight, though.
It gives you an idea, because that's where I started thinking, well, where does Exodus and Leviticus fit all in? I know all the books, I thought pretty well, but if you had asked me a month ago, which fits in where, I wasn't quite sure. So now to know that Leviticus has no time frame, neither does Deuteronomy, that's stop, look, and listen time. Any comments at all about this before we get into today's lesson? All right, well then let's go to today's lesson entitled Freedom Promised. Promised because freedom isn't come today. Will gets to introduce freedom next week. It's probably promised today, and we're just looking at two passages. The first part of chapter 5 and the first part of chapter 6. So let's go right away into first verse in chapter 5. We're going to spend a lot of time on that first verse. I forgot to bring my watch, so I'm going to have to get my phone periodically and see what time it is. Okay. Will, would you mind reading that first verse for us?
Absolutely. And afterwards Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness."
Thank you. All right, first thing I think of when I look at this verse is the second word, afterward. And I'm asking myself, after what? Well, that provides a 30-second review of what Will covered last week. We have the children of Israel persecuted by the Egyptians. Moses is born and grows up in Pharaoh's palace. After 40 years, he sees the plight of the Israelites. He kills an Egyptian. His deed is found out. He flees to Midian. God speaks to Moses 40 years later at the burning bush. And, I didn't put it in here, but after much arguing by Moses,
Yes.
he eventually is commissioned to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And then from there he heads back towards Egypt where he meets his brother Aaron on the way. And then they go before the leaders of the Hebrews and share the good news of what God has shared to Moses. And the people say it is wonderful news. They're so happy. They worship at that point in time. That's the first 4 chapters of Exodus, given in 30 seconds. But I did want to mention one thing as I was thinking about this. And somebody asked us in our class on Sunday. We covered this Sunday in our class, and I got to thinking more about it. And I'll share my opinion on this, is that how much biblical history, I guess I would say, did these Israelites have at that time?
Oh, yeah, right.
My opinion is they had a lot. And there's a little bit of supporting evidence in the Bible, because if you went to any of these people, you could ask them, tell us your heritage. They could tell you who their father was, their grandfather, great-grandfather. They knew their lineage all the way back to the first of the 12 patriarchs. So they could say, oh, I'm all the way from Levi, or all the way from Judah or Simeon. And we see evidence of that later on in the scriptures when you see their lineage. They know all those names. So I'm thinking that everybody knew their heritage all the way back to Levi. And if you knew you're back to Levi or Judah or whatever, then you knew the next 3, which was Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham. Now, are we to assume that's the only thing they knew from Abraham, is that they were descended from him? Or had they heard some of the stories as well? Had they heard some of the stories that Abraham had experienced, or Isaac had experienced, or Jacob? I don't see why not. You didn't have TV. You didn't have the internet. So how do you pass the time? I mean, besides building bricks. You know, you share stories. You share stories amongst your family. Let me tell you a story about it. I mean, I do that with my kids. I tell them stories that I've heard from my granddaddy. And so, you know, it's because that's as far back as I know the stories. Well, I've even heard a few stories from his dad, so I'll share those with my kids too. And that's just natural. You like to do that. There's no reason that I'm thinking to think that they didn't have some background from Abraham on and knew their lineage, maybe knew some of the stories. That's going to fit in with today's lesson a little bit. Again, my opinion, if we get to heaven and we find out it's different, you can say, Lee, you were wrong. That's all right. I won't bother me a bit.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to this first verse, though, because there's more in here, because we've only looked at afterward. They come to Pharaoh and they say, Lord, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. And just to clarify things, I want to look a little bit at this word Lord, but is Lord and God synonymous with each other? Do they mean the same things? The answer actually is no. And here's why. And this is why I wanted to point it out, because we see both of those words used a lot in the Bible. The word God is from the Hebrew, the word Elohim. And most of the time in the Bible, it's referring to the God that we worship. However, the word Elohim is more of a generic term for God. It was also used to talk about other gods, the gods of the Egyptians, the gods of the Canaanites, the gods made of wood and stone. That same word Elohim is used to describe that. So it's more of a generic term for God. The word Lord, as Will pointed out last week, is a name that God gave Moses and said, "This is my name." As a matter of fact, in Exodus 3:15 that Will looked at last week, he said in that last part, "This is my name forever, and this is the name for all generations to use to call upon me." And every time you see the word Lord in the Bible, it's not this Lord. The way you can distinguish it, most Bible translations, I don't know if the ones that we're passing out do this or not, most of them will put Lord, you see in all caps. That's to distinguish from other Lord, like, the Lord of Egypt or whatever, or, you lord it over someone else. That's a totally different Hebrew word. But anytime you see it in all caps, it's that word Yahweh, or however it's supposed to be pronounced, we don't know for sure. And then it's talking about that covenant name that God gave Moses for the first time, using that name. As I was thinking about this, then I'm processing this in my mind over the last few weeks, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, but don't we see that word in Genesis a lot? And yet, God gave it to Moses in Exodus.
Yes.
Well, then I started looking back at where it's used in Genesis. First of all, I remembered, who wrote Genesis? Moses. He wrote it after he learned that name.
That's right.
So, and then I looked at how is it used in Genesis, and it's used as Moses is describing who is speaking or what God is doing. It's not used as someone is saying that's who that is.
That's right.
It's only used describing him. So that's why you see it back in Genesis, because now Moses can refer to him by his covenant name because he now knows that name. So that made me feel a lot better, because then I was getting pretty confused on that. So check it out. I'm not 100% on that, but 99% that fits.
That is great.
It's just we see the word God and we think our God, but God is a generic term. Elohim. It's also plural, but I won't get into that. That's a lesson in Genesis chapter 1.
We did cover that.
You got it. Anyway, let's go back one more time to our verse, because now he says, this is what the Lord says, but they have to say more than what the Lord, because this is a relatively new name. Does Pharaoh know that name Yahweh? No, he's never heard it before. And so, to clarify it for Pharaoh, he has to say, this is what the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel. So he's explaining who that name is. It's the God of Israel. This is what he says, let my people go, they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness. Why in the wilderness? I don't know, there could be reasons. I don't know 100% for sure myself. Maybe there was the idea of not wanting to worship God in a place that's already been defiled by Egyptian idols. Whatever the case, maybe they had time for separation. Whatever the case, the important thing is God told them to do this. As you're going to see a little bit later, we're going to cover a verse that Will didn't cover because he couldn't cover it all. And you're going to see God instructed him to do this. But that takes us then to our second verse. Will, would you mind reading that for us again?
So Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and besides, I will not let Israel go."
Thank you. Pharaoh's response is totally reasonable, for two regards. First one is, he doesn't know the Lord, like you said, but even more importantly than that, who's the master and who's the slave in this situation?
Yeah.
And so, why should the master be concerned about the God of the slaves? If he is not powerful enough to take care of himself, I'm not going to worry about him. My gods apparently are more powerful than your gods because I'm the master and you're the slave. That's logical. Second thing is, I will not let Israel go. He's got cheap labor. Why should he give up cheap labor? And so he's not going to do that. That's really, I think, his greatest reason.
Absolutely.
And you're going to see that repeated here in a minute. But why get rid of cheap labor? So he's not going to do it. He says no. Well, Moses and Aaron could have just turned around and said, well, he said no, let's go away. But they decide to give it one more shot. And so we see that in verse 3. Dawn, would you mind reading that for us?
Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Otherwise, he will strike us with plague or with the sword."
Thank you. They add a little bit to what they shared earlier, a little bit that I don't see God sharing with them. Doesn't mean he didn't, it's just not recorded in Scripture. But they mention it, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Not just that he's told us to share this, but he's met with us. They add the word please in there, which very respectful. We've talked about having respect for unbelievers before. He's respectful, and then they give the same message, let us go 3 days' journey so we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And then they have this other line, otherwise he will strike us with plague or with the sword.
Yeah.
I have no clue why they said that myself. Our study guides mention something about this word us. They say it could mean when they said that, us meaning us the Hebrews, or it could mean us, all of us who are in Egypt, both the Hebrews and the Egyptians. And the study guide's right, it could mean either one. I didn't really think about that before, but it's true. I have no idea. So if you wanted to ask me about why they said that, I don't know. I have this list of questions I want to ask when I get to heaven, and so I was thinking I got to add that to the list because I don't have the answer for why they said that. I trust that it's true, but it's not going to happen. Well, then we get to, let's see, did I hit the right button?
Yep.
I did, okay. We get to Pharaoh's response. Would you mind reading that again, Don?
But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why do you let the people neglect their work? Get back to your labors."
Okay, thanks. This is his real reason. I got cheap labor.
That's right.
One thing about the God, your God's inferior to our gods, but this is really why I want you here. Cheap labor. Why are you neglecting the work? We got bricks. We got a dynasty to build here. Get back to your labors. Well, that's the last part that we're studying in chapter 5, but I just wanted to quickly summarize the rest of it. And so these aren't verses, but they're my summary of the verses. In the next several verses, it says, Pharaoh no longer supplied straw for the people to make bricks, but the Israelites were still required to fulfill the same quotas as before. Do you think they were able to do it? No. As a matter of fact, they probably had a difficult time making the quotas beforehand, because that's what you do when you're making quotas. Quotas are to push you, and they're being pushed. So
Okay.
the people now have to collect their own straw to make the bricks. They're not given it anymore, and just like we predicted, they're not able to make the quota. We're in Exodus, and so as a result, the foremen were beaten. Now the foremen, just so you know, the foremen were Hebrews.
Right.
The Egyptians were smart in how they set this up. They made the Hebrews to be foremen, and then they didn't have to worry about giving everybody the instructions. They gave the instructions to the foreman. The foremen were responsible to give the instructions to all the slaves. But when it came, if you didn't make your quota, guess who got beaten? It was the foreman. So they got beaten. They understandably felt it was unfair, and so they go to Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells them why they were being beaten. You're not making your quota. Well, you're not giving us straw. Well, ask Moses and Aaron about it. They seem to think you got a lot of spare time on your hands. You got time enough to worship God in the wilderness. So the foremen meet Moses and Aaron. They blame Moses and Aaron for their plight. And here's where we'll just read the last couple of verses in chapter 5, because although this wasn't a part of our lesson, there was a lesson here I couldn't pass up.
Yeah.
So would you mind reading this for us, Will?
Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, Lord, why have you brought harm to this people? Why did you ever send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done harm to this people, and you have not rescued your people at all.
Thank you. You can see the agony that Moses is going through for his people. And in one respect, it's very understandable. I'm going to use this as an example in a minute for each of us. I think each of us go through times like what Moses is talking about right here. But there's one thing that we skipped last week. It was in chapter 3 that Moses seems to have forgotten. Because I'm going to go back to chapter 3 here. And this is when Moses is at the burning bush, and God is giving him all these additional instructions about what he wants to do. And this is one of the things he says. He says, and you with the elders of Israel will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, had met with us. So now, please let us go to a 3 days journey into the wilderness, so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Stop there for a minute. Isn't that exactly what they did?
Yes.
Okay, they did that. So what's the problem? Well, look what else God says to them next. But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go, except under compulsion. So I will reach out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it, and after that he may let you go.
Yeah.
So did Moses know that Pharaoh was going to say no?
Yes.
He did. But when you're in the middle of a major crisis in your life, do you always remember all that?
No.
But it's important to remember it. He should have remembered that God told me this, and more importantly, God sees the big picture. And he even shares just a glimpse of that big picture here with Moses. He says, I am going to strike Egypt with all my miracles, and then he's going to let you go. I have a bigger plan in mind than what you've been dealing with here, Moses. I see the big picture, you don't. Now, he gives Moses later on a little bit of a glimpse, but he doesn't tell him about all 10 plagues. Moses is going to just have to learn that along with everybody else. So, looking at that statement where Moses says, ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's done harm to this people and you have not rescued your people at all, I think that can apply to us as well. We all experience different crises in our life. It could be a health crisis for ourselves or a loved one. It could be a financial crisis, again, for ourselves or a loved one. It could be the death of someone very close to us, spouse, a family member, a friend. It could be a relationship that someone we were close to that is now torn apart. We've all gone through some of those, and we may continue to go through some of those, because that's unfortunately a part of living in a sin-cursed world, is we go through those things. So the question is, what do we do when we're in that? Do we do like Moses and we start to blame God? Oh, woe is me. Why are you doing this? That's what I start to do. But we, like Moses, should start to think about the promises that God has already given us. Like, I will never leave you or forsake you. Or, greater is he that is in me, that is he that is in the world. What was some of the others I was thinking about? But there, you can recall those promises that God has given you and say, God, I don't know the big picture, but you do, and I have to trust you. Now, we can't do that if we don't know the Scripture.
That's right.
So that means we need to learn the Scripture. David said, I will hide God's word in my heart that I might not sin against you, but I would add to it so that I might trust you and trust your promises. So, just a good lesson for us. We're going to be just like Moses. Are we going to be just like Moses? Or are we going to trust him in the midst of that adversity? It's hard to do, but that's when we need to cling to the Scriptures the most.
Now, this is all before they were executed, right?
Exactly. This is why, in fact, I forgot to mention, that first time in the beginning of chapter 5, that's the first time that Aaron and Moses meet with Pharaoh. First of many, but that's the very first time. So they haven't been rescued yet, but that's their first time they visited. So thanks, I forgot to mention that, Ralph. Good.
Let me just throw Romans 8:18 in there.
Uh,
I believe that the present suffering, whatever it may be, that's me adding that, is nothing compared to the coming glory that is going to be revealed to us. One of the things to
Yes.
remember, right, in our human reactions to a divine process, like we see here Moses doing, is God promises that whatever befalls us ultimately will be of no comparison to what he has, to the goodness he has in store for us. We need to try to
That's
hang on
right.
to that.
The important thing is we have to. Well, I thought of Paul, who I think figured this out, because he writes in one place where he says, "I have learned to be content in whatever circumstance I'm in." And where was he? In jail when he wrote that. So he had learned this, as opposed to Moses not learning this yet at this point. So a reminder for us. Well, we continue on to verse 1 of chapter 6, which is just before our next passage. Time. We're doing. All right. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for under compulsion he will let them go, and under compulsion he will drive them out of this land." So it's as if, now we saw that in chapter 3. God had told Moses that, but he seemed to have forgot it. So it's as if Moses says, "Remember what I said a few months ago to you, or a month ago? Remember what I said?" This is almost word for word what God had said earlier too. So it's a great reminder that God is giving Moses. And then he's going to go on, and I'm going to go through some of this quickly because I want to make sure I get to the last part. But he further spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am the Lord, and I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty. But by name Lord, I did not make myself known to them." So this kind of reiterates what I was talking about earlier. He gives him the name Lord again. And notice how, well, in fact, I did point this out earlier. How was God referred to in Genesis? And there's a couple things. One is mentioned right here. Lord, I said, was Yahweh. God, he was sometimes referred to by El Shaddai, and God had given that to Abraham actually. But most of the time, when you see God mentioned in Genesis, he's referred to as the God of Abraham, or the God of Isaac, or the God of Jacob. That's as close as he comes to a name, besides his other one, El Shaddai, and there's a few others. But when I first worked on Genesis years ago, I thought El Shaddai was more of a name. Now I'm taking a step back and thinking, well, that's not so much a name as it is a character trait.
Yes.
Those are character traits. And some of the other names he was given in Genesis just describe other character traits, like he sees all, and he's everlasting, and here he's almighty. But Yahweh is now this unique name that he has. And so just refreshing again that he's known as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Now he's known as Yahweh. Continuing on, I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as strangers. So God is continuing now to talk to Moses in response to Moses' complaint. But he talks about a covenant. What covenant are we talking about here? You got it. The Abrahamic covenant. And I won't read the whole thing. And you find it initially in Genesis 12, 1-3. I just want to focus on one part. He talks about you're going to leave where you live, and I will take you to a land which I will show you. Which my interpretation of that is when God gave him that covenant, Abraham did not know exactly what land it was going to be.
That's right.
He said, "It's going to be a land that I will show you." And then it's not until verse 7 in chapter 12, when Abraham is standing in Canaan, and God says to him, "The Lord appeared to Abraham." Notice Moses uses that word Lord, but it's describing God. Appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give you this land. So finally Abraham learns what's the land that it was promised to him. And so in chapter 6 verse 4, God is reminding Moses about that and saying they lived as strangers there. Another word could be aliens. We're familiar with aliens nowadays, aren't we? That's a subject all the time. This subject is going to come up in a minute again. Furthermore, I have heard, because God is still speaking to Moses, he says, furthermore, I have heard the groanings of the sons of Israel because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Now, you can take remembered two ways. The first way is God forget this? Is he all of a sudden saying, oh my stars, 600 years ago I made a promise to Abraham, and it just recurred to me again, that's the promise I made. Well, if we know anything about God, we know that's an incorrect interpretation, but this occurs in other times in the Bible. So when you see that, don't think that somehow God forgot and all of a sudden it comes back to him. I'm going to give you the Lee Arnold translation for this, which I think works a little bit better. And that is, it's really, the word is, I have not forgotten. So you see the word remembered, put not forgotten in place of it. So when he's saying that, he's saying, really, I have not forgotten my covenant. I've never forgotten it. I've always remembered it. It's just, it's in my time.
Right.
It's been 600 years, but it's not time yet. But we're coming close, Moses. We're coming close. Well, we got a long passage here near the end. And Will, would you mind reading that for us?
Sure. Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the labors of the Egyptians, and I will rescue you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Then I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the labors of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord.
Thank you. Reason I have this all together is because it looks like that this was meant to be looked at together. Structurally, and I'll show you an example. It starts off when God says, say this to the sons of Israel. He starts off with saying, I am the Lord. Look at how he ends it. I am the Lord. So he uses the exact same phrase, and sandwiched in between that then are some very important truths about God, and we can see those because 7 times a 2-word phrase is repeated. Now, if you know anything about the number 7 in the Bible, 7 is the idea of completeness. It's also the number for God. Is that the reason why that occurs 7 times? I don't know, but I'm going to pay attention if that is occurring 7 times. And so let's just take a look at the 7 I wills that God says. So he didn't say I might, I maybe will do this. He says I will. And if God says I will, he will. So let's see. What is the first I will?
Bring you out from under your labors of the Egyptians.
That's right. Labors of the Egyptians. Now, labors is a little different than work. Work is not a 4-letter word. I mean, it is, but it's not. God gave Adam work to do in the garden before there was ever sin. So work can be fulfilling. It's a good thing. It's a blessing that God gives us. This is a little different. This is labors and under. This is hard toil. It's the kind of work that slaves would do. Hard work, which is going to tie in with this second one. I will rescue you from their bondage. When I first saw those, I'm thinking they're the same thing. And then I realized, no, it's slightly different. Labors is the actual physical labor, back-breaking, hard, difficult. The second one is slavery. I'm going to rescue you from your bondage. You are going to have freedom. You can still work, but you're going to have freedom. But your work won't be labor. It's going to be work, and hopefully fulfilling work. So the first 2 I wills that God gives the people. From there, He says, I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. The word redeemed here, mentioned in our study guide, is it's a legal word. Normally, and not exclusively, many times when you see that word redeemed, redeem in the Bible, it's a redemption even of land. So for example, if you were poor and you had to sell your land, and land was very important to the Israelites. You had your family heritage properties. So if you had to sell it, that was a great loss. But you could have a family member who had the finances, and they could pay and redeem that land back for you. So they were paying a price that you couldn't pay to get you something that you couldn't get on your own. Great picture of what God did for us, didn't he? Mm-hmm. We all owe a debt. We owe a debt of sin. And the wages of sin is death. Mm-hmm. But God gave his son to pay that debt for us. He redeemed us. That was a debt we couldn't pay on our own. Mm-hmm. So, great picture of what God's going to do, did for us, and what he's doing here for them. He's redeeming them. The study guide also mentioned something I didn't know about, is in non-biblical writings from that time, the Egyptian pharaohs were told to have a mighty arm. And so it's interesting that God uses that same picture. I'm going to redeem you with an outstretched arm. As if he's saying, you think Pharaoh's arm is mighty? Wait till you see my arm. We'll see whose God is greater. So I'm going to redeem you with an outstretched arm. Well, and then my favorite, these two right here. I will take you as my people. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I don't get that last part there, and with great judgments.
My understanding about that one is, because he's talking about what he's about to do for them. He's going to redeem them, and part of that is he's bringing them out of Egypt, which is what he's already covered in the first two I wills. You know, I'm going to bring you out of Egypt, and it's going to be through a redemption process. I'm going to do something for you you couldn't do for yourself. And it's going to be with an outstretched arm, which talks about strength, which we know God is all-powerful. But then that great judgments, to me, I'm thinking that's referring to the 10 plagues.
That's exactly right.
The 10 plagues.
The plagues.
The 10 plagues.
The plagues that he judgment on Egypt.
So to me, that's what I'm thinking those great judgments are. He's going to redeem them through the 10 plagues. And that's a spoiler alert for what Will's going to cover next week. Will's going to talk about those plagues and how God redeems them through that.
But this ties into your lesson here, where and you've mentioned it a couple of times. Only by compulsion will Pharaoh let the people go. He's asking for it. I'm going to give it to him.
Yes.
That's the price of redeeming you. I'm going to give Pharaoh just what he's asking for.
God's got this whole grand scheme of things, and it includes giving him what he's asking for. It includes sharing which God is more powerful.
Yes.
It includes the promised redemption in just his right time. All of that, and it's going to be through primarily the 10 plagues.
Yes.
Other things besides, but primarily the 10 plagues. I'm glad you asked that question.
But the legal aspect of redemption is there's an asking price.
Mm-hmm.
And God's gonna pay it. Pharaoh's asking price is make me. And God will supply that price.
He will meet that price. You're exactly right. Pharaoh will do that. These next two I wills, as I said, are my favorite. Because, and I'll just share a little bit here. As I've studied the Bible over the years, I think the major theme in the Bible, my own opinion, major theme in the Bible is God's passionate desire to have a relationship with people. Now you might say, no, I thought the major theme was Jesus. The greatest thing that God did to have a relationship with people is give his son Jesus. But there are many things that God did before and after that we see in the Bible, and we're going to see several of those in this book of Exodus. And so those are just other things. God's constantly taking the initiative. I want to have a relationship with you. I want to have a relationship with you. I want to have that relationship. And so we see numerous things in Genesis, in Exodus. We're going to see a lot in Exodus. I'm sure we'll point some of those out. But the ultimate thing was giving his son, Jesus. So when I think of God's passionate desire, and when I first, I actually wrote a book on this, and that was my title, God's Passion. I thought, is passion the right word to use? But think about a passion. A passion is something that obsesses you more than anything else, right? You spend more of your time on that than anything else. That's what I think God does. He spends more of his time on trying to create a relationship with us than anything else. He enjoyed that relationship with the Garden of Eden, and he wants to have it back with each one of us. So that's, to me, that's his passion. So when he says, I will take you as my people, I love you, I've always loved you, I want to have a relationship with you, and a relationship is a two-way street, and so I want to be your God. I will be your God. And you will be my people. That's a relationship. That's what he wants. Any comments about that? Well, then we come to the last two I wills, and they're related to each other. I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he's going to bring them back there. We know that's going to be true. It's going to take 40 years, unfortunately, but he's going to bring them back there. But then the next one is even better. I will give it to you as a possession. Remember when Abraham was in the land, it wasn't a possession. Actually, he paid for a field with a cave at one end. That's the only part of Canaan he ever possessed. All of the rest of his living there, excuse me, he was a stranger or an alien. He was a guest. He didn't possess any of it. God is going to take it one step further, and he says, I'm going to give it to these Israelite people as a descendant. Actually, it's going to be their children, because they're all going to die in the wilderness. Well, that's such great news. Moses then turns around and he shares it. He said this to the sons of Israel, and they accepted it gladly and were joyful. No, that's not what it says. But they did not listen to Moses on account of their despondency and cruel bondage. It's tough. As we said earlier, it's tough when you're in the middle of a crisis. It's tough to trust God. And so I can't blame them, because I've been in the same situation. I've had a tough time trusting God. But we got to rely on God's promises.
That's right.
We got to trust him. And so if I don't know if that's the lesson that our study guide brought, but that's the lesson that I get from all of this. We need to trust God. It's something we all deal with. And so that's the end of our section there. Any comments about that at all? Any
Well,
questions?
isn't this meant to keep the Jews in close sin and tell them if they follow, then these good things will happen.
That's the message that Moses will continue to give them through his lifetime. They don't always listen, but you're right. He wants to give them that message. He wants them to be in a relationship with him. And if you follow me, we're going to have a great relationship. If you don't follow me and don't trust me, we're going to have some problems.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. We suffer the same consequences sometimes too.